Just start things by looking at the pre-week assignment and kind of going over those questions. I don't really have a big schedule for today. I wanted to kind of see how this goes. So I think what we will do, if it's okay with both of you, kind of look at the general questions first, and we can kind of go over them and see if we can kind of get to the logic and the understanding here. And then once we do that, we can talk about these novel applications and some other maybe related issues. If you have the book as well, we'll try to map it back to some of the book issues as well. So let's see, what was question 1? Summarize the general purpose of systematic desensitization and describe how it was related to classical conditioning. Now, I haven't seen your answer to this point. I've seen hers and I've seen Shannon's. Would you care to, how did you address that particular question? What is systematic desensitization, Devin?
So I have it as a behavioral technique.
A behavioral technique. So it's behavioral is often the word that they use for behaviorism based, because almost any technique in psychology is like behavioral, but when they say behavioral technique, it's a specific reference to the field of behaviorism as opposed to other fields. So a behavioral technique, keep going.
And it's used for treating phobias and anxiety disorders.
So the uses, phobias and anxiety type disorders. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what else did I put?
Okay. Well, let me check with Deb as well. There's a similar definition from your end. What is systematic desensitization in your book?
Since I wasn't at home, I didn't print mine off. Are you okay with pulling mine out?
Yes, I can, if that's okay with you.
It's fine with me.
I'm going to ask that. I'm going to have to ask you because I got to go to the grade book here.
Okay.
Maybe to have both of you not look at the board for a minute or so.
Okay.
Let's get close. We're getting there. Okay, you can look now. So obviously, if you do a pre-week assignment, if you can bring them in, that's useful. But yeah, this is fine with me too, as long as we just don't look at other folks. This is yours, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so what did you have to say about this, Ms. Deb?
So it's a principle founded under the principle of counter conditioning, and part of the classical conditioning. And it's a model to reduce anxiety and related to fearful situations. And then I broke it down into kind of basically how does it work.
Uh-huh.
And talked about the fact that it goes back to, the technique of introspection, where you're looking within and trying to evaluate the fear stimulus,
Uh-huh.
understand it a little bit more. And related that back to Pavlov.
Yeah, so let's actually go back. The word, and Shannon had something similar. The purpose of systematic desensitization is to help people manage anxiety and phobias about fearful events. It's related to classical conditioning, she wrote, because we can be conditioned to be fearful. So fear is something that we learn. And so the idea is if you can learn fear, then this idea is to go against that. That's what the word, and it's a really good word you use there, Debbie. It's counter conditioning. And so even on the test next week, using words like that, counter conditioning, because what does that term mean to you, Debbie, when you write that word out? What
means you're changing what you have already been conditioned to respond to. So
this is of critical importance in behavior therapy, because most things that are phobias have been learned, and you've learned these classical conditioning things. And the purpose of behavioral therapy, especially classical conditioning techniques, retrain them. Put other stimuli and responses there. Put other associative stimuli there. So it's trying to counter condition what's already been learned. Now, you were very interesting with what you put here. You used the word at one point, was it down a little bit, the word Introspection.
Mhm.
Was that down? Oh, there it is.
Yeah,
It's C there.
C.
What was your, give me a little more of a take on why you put the word introspection there and how you saw that kind of fitting in here.
Well, kind of going back to what we had talked about
Uh-huh.
earlier on in the class, and you know, in order to kind of figure out what the fear factor is, where did it kind of come from, and really break it down and identify. You know, you have to kind of identify A, what the fear is, and B, kind of understand where it came from, but also understand, you know, what's the most, you know, kind of prioritize,
Uh-huh.
get a hierarchy.
And figure out how to break it down, because the other thing about that makes me question a little bit with the word introspection, and I think we even chatted about this last week, how did the behaviorists actually feel about the introspection people?
They didn't like them. Well,
Now, why didn't they like them?
so more appropriately, I feel like they felt that they were beneath, or they were above them.
They were above them. In what ways?
Scientific.
It wasn't scientific, because introspection is kind of consciousness and perception and trying to be scientific, but it's really a lot of self-report. So I like what you're actually saying, and this might be a very good point to kind of bridge them together in a way, because what you were sharing, Debbie, was the idea that if you're going to do behavioral therapy, there has to be some self-reflection about where the problem is. What are the stimuli? You are doing introspection in a way, but what causes you to feel that way? I think a behaviorist would be comfortable with that idea of figuring out what you're upset about. But in the movement of introspection, and actually in the movement of therapy, some forms of therapy, which might be useful to talk about as well, so introspection linked to that. In some types of therapy, you have what we call the aha moment. You figure things out. Oh, that's the reason. Is that important in a lot of therapies? It is. The aha moment, the breakthrough, the figuring it out. Oh, that's why that happens. The question is that important in behaviorism? Is it really important to a behaviorist to figure out and have that aha moment?
For their research, I would think probably they're not so concerned because it's not scientific. But I would think from the aspect of working with the person, if the person doesn't understand kind of where things have started from,
Then it's going to be important maybe to understand to start the therapy. You got to figure out what is that term we use to say, oh yeah, I used to just get scared of this, and now it's not just that, it's this thing before that thing, and then it's this thing before that thing and the other. Do you remember what the term is to describe that? There's a term used to describe this idea that it's not just this stimuli anymore. I'm not just scared of flying prop planes, but now when I woke up that morning and when I made the flight reservation, we're kind of adding stimuli on.
right.
What is that term called? Or maybe I can give you a clue. Is it called generalization or higher order conditioning?
Generalization.
Would be the wrong answer.
It's higher condition.
It's generalization is where you respond in a similar way to something a little different.
Okay.
Higher order is where these things get linked up. It's not just the flight now. It's getting the airplane ticket. It's knowing you have to travel. Things become so classically conditioned up the pipeline. So I think introspection would be important just to figure out what are those stimuli.
Okay.
But with therapy, some of the therapists are like, well, if you know what these things are, then you're solved. That is not, and it's very important for classical conditioning. If you're in classical conditioning, it's almost the idea that just knowing something is not going to fix you. We have to change the stimuli and responses. So very important maybe to write for the notes that just self-knowledge, understanding, is not going to be freedom. You have to change the stimuli and response. You can know everything about why you wake up that morning, why you're scared of the airplane, why buying that ticket is, why this anxiety is developing. That's not going to help you in behaviorism. What's going to help you in behaviorism is somebody counter-conditioning you. Scared of the dentist? Go in and get counter-conditioned. Awareness is not therapy.
I did like that example in the book.
What did they use?
It wasn't, the child had never actually had a negative experience with the dentist himself, but he had watched his friend have a negative experience, which started him from that I have no thought to it's bad and I never want to get involved.
So a good example there as well was somebody watching somebody else. In normal classical conditioning, that wouldn't be classified as learning, but that's what we call social learning. You can learn by watching others, and the same types of aversions can develop. So that's a wonderful example of social learning theory. We can learn by watching. Do you guys know the big theorist with that one? It's a perfect example and a great. Are you guys familiar with the Bobo doll situation?
Yeah.
What's the Bobo doll scene, Debbie? What do you know about the Bobo doll?
The bubble doll is like a blown up thing, and a woman comes in and she's punching at the bubble doll, and then she goes out, and the kid that is in there watching then goes over and starts punching the Bobo doll.
So the classic Bobo doll experiment, which you would want to know, by Bandura, 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 social learning, is if you watch somebody else smash a Bobo doll, a parent, and then you go in the room, you'll do the same thing. It's unique in a way because for most classical conditioning and operant conditioning, you need reinforcement or stimuli. In this case, you just learn by watching. So it's observational learning. But it can have the same rules, right, of anxiety-based disorders. So a great example there. Okay, so we've got our definition here. We've looked at the word introspection. It can map to that because you have to figure out what these stimuli are. So in that way, it's good. But at the same time, it's not, introspection in terms of the scientific movement. It's just being aware and figuring out what these things are to try to eliminate and counter condition. Okay, let's stop that recording. Let's see how much time on that went on for.